Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to untangle complex topics, pull out the key facts, and figure out what really matters, especially for you. Today, we're diving into something that's, well, not just complex, but really critical, Iran's nuclear program. Our mission is to unpack the very latest developments. We're specifically focusing on the recent military strikes and, maybe more importantly, what Iran's capabilities look like now, even after those strikes. It's a landscape full of conflicting narratives, honestly, and our goal is to help you cut through all that noise to understand what's genuinely happening. We've pulled from really credible sources the Institute for Science and International Security, ISIS, that is the scientific think tank, obviously not the other group. Also the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, various news reports, and even commentary from, prominent public figures.
Yeah, it truly is an incredibly multi-layered situation. And understanding these nuances, it feels more urgent than ever. There are just so many moving parts, right? From the technical details of enrichment levels all the way to the broad geopolitical ripples. So our aim in this deep dive is really to give you a clear, sort of distilled picture of this constantly evolving and, frankly, high-stakes situation.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with maybe the baseline. Before these recent strikes happened, what did the international community, especially the IAEA, actually know about Iran's nuclear capabilities? Say, as of May 2025, what was the starting line here?
Right. Well, as of May 17, 2025, Iran had a really significant amount of 60% highly enriched uranium, HEU. We're talking over 408 kilograms in uranium mass. And just to give you a sense of the scale, that was a net increase of almost 134 kilograms since the last time they reported. What's particularly concerning about this 60% HEU isn't just the sheer amount, but its weaponization potential. The Institute for Science and International Security, ISIS, they describe it as being 99% of the way to weapon-grade uranium. That's in terms of, the enrichment work needed.
99%.
Yeah. It's the hardest part of the enrichment process, the initial heavy lifting. It's pretty much done.
Okay, 99% of the way there. That's not just a number. It means Iran theoretically had a rapid, significant potential arsenal. What does that actually translate to in terms of weapons, and how fast could they get there?
Exactly. Based on ISIS's benchmark, they use about 25 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium per weapon. This stockpile of 60% HEU is enough for 9 nuclear weapons.
9.
And the speed. It's truly alarming. The formal breakout timeline is considered 0. Effectively 0. This isn't just like a theoretical number. It means Iran could potentially produce enough weapon-grade uranium for their first bomb in just a matter of days.
Days.
We're talking 2 to 3 days to get that first 25 kilograms from their 60% stock, just at the Fordow fuel enrichment plant. And if you look at Fordow and the Natanz fuel enrichment plant combined, well, they could potentially churn out weapon-grade uranium for 11 nuclear weapons in the first month alone.
11 in the first month.
And it could rise to 15 by the end of the second month, 19 by the third, 21 by the fourth, and maybe 22 by the fifth month.
That's an incredibly fast escalation capability. It basically eliminates any real diplomatic response time, doesn't it?
It really does.
Is there any civilian justification for producing uranium enriched to that level, 60%, in those quantities?
No. There's absolutely no civilian use or justification for Iran to be producing hundreds of kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. None. The IAEA itself said this is of serious concern. Their sort of aggressive rush to produce more and how they were quickly depleting their 20% stock.
Right, the stuff they do have a use for.
Exactly. The 20% does have civilian use in research reactors. So burning through that strongly suggests an intent to quickly produce large quantities of weapon-grade uranium. They dramatically increased their 60% HEU production. They did this by feeding 20% enriched uranium into 2 interconnected IR-6 cascades at Fordow. This resulted in nearly a 7-fold increase in their average monthly production just from Fordow.
So they're basically cannibalizing their lower enriched stock to get to the weapons usable levels faster. And this whole push was backed up by some serious infrastructure, right? What about the centrifuges? How many did they have running?
Precisely. Iran had nearly 14,700 advanced centrifuges installed at Natanz and Fordow. If you include the older IR-1 models, the total number was around 21,900. This gave them a massive total installed enrichment capacity, about 64,000 separative work units per year, which means they could produce highly enriched uranium at a really alarming rate. Fordow, especially, had become this strategically vital multi-purpose facility. It could produce HEU, and it was easily modifiable for direct weapon-grade uranium production from that 60% stock using a pretty sophisticated 3-step interconnected process.
Okay, so that was the picture. A nation rapidly piling up near weapons-grade material, looking like clear intent and the industrial base to make it happen fast. But then the headlines hit. Military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And this is where it gets really complicated, doesn't it? The assessments of the impact seem, frankly, all over the place. What actually happened and what are these different reports claiming about the damage?
You're absolutely right. The assessments are all over the map. So the strikes involved both Israel's Operation Rising Lion and then subsequent U.S. attacks. At Natanz, for example, Israeli strikes on June 13th hit the pilot fuel enrichment plant, the PFEP, and also electrical infrastructure. Satellite imagery showed explosive craters right over the underground fuel enrichment plant halls, suggesting, pretty substantial damage. Then the U.S. attacked Natanz again on June 22nd, this time with at least one GBU-57 bunker buster. The assessment was that this likely destroyed and knocked out of operation the site.
And Fordow, that facility you mentioned, the one buried deep underground, the one that was such a worry.
Yeah, Fordow. On June 22nd, the U.S. dropped 12 GBU-57 MOPs. Those are massive ordnance penetrators over Fordow's deeply buried enrichment halls. They hit ventilation shafts, service structures. The facility is considered likely severely damaged or destroyed. Interestingly, there were also reports that the Iranians tried to backfill some tunnels just before the strike, which, could have been an attempt to maybe limit damage or perhaps move critical material out.
And it wasn't just the enrichment sites, right? They targeted other parts of the program, too.
Correct. Beyond those really critical enrichment facilities, the strikes also targeted a whole range of other key sites. These are vital to Iran's broader nuclear infrastructure.
Like what? What other sites were hit?
Well, the Iraq heavy water reactor had its containment dome breached on June 19th, which rendered it inoperable. Importantly, it was actually unfinished and non-operational at the time, so the strike didn't cause any radioactive contamination.
Ah, okay.
The associated heavy water production plant was also severely damaged. Other significant targets included the Esfahan nuclear complex. That's where they handle uranium conversion and fuel fabrication. Also, Leviathan 2, a former SPND headquarters.
SPND being their weapons research organization.
That's right. Also, the new SPND headquarters, the Tabatiza Krash centrifuge manufacturing site, and Sangerian, which is an old Ahmad site that showed signs of recent reactivation. All of those sustained significant damage, according to reports.
So, a pretty broad campaign hitting key notes. Now let's get back to those conflicting narratives about how effective it all was. President Trump and the White House were making some very strong claims, but then you had the U.S. intelligence community seemingly painting a very different picture. What was that discrepancy?
It was stark. President Donald Trump consistently asserted that Iran's nuclear sites were completely destroyed and obliterated, full stop. He claimed the strikes set back Iran's nuclear program by decades, and even compared the impact to the Hiroshima bombing.
Decades! Hiroshima.
Those are strong words, very strong. And White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt doubled down, stating that any contradictory reports were flat out wrong and a clear attempt to demean President Trump. She added, everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets. Total obliteration.
Right. Total obliteration.
Mm-hmm.
But given what we know about deeply buried targets like Fordow and just the general complexities of these kinds of operations, is total obliteration even a realistic outcome? Or is that maybe more political language? Because then we heard from the intel community.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating contrast. And it kind of highlights the gap that can sometimes exist between, let's say, political messaging and the ground truth from intelligence assessments. An initial classified assessment from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, indicated a much, much more limited impact. They suggested the strikes only set back Iran's program by a matter of months, or maybe a few months tops.
Months, not decades.
Exactly. This assessment found that while, yes, facility entrances were sealed, the underground infrastructure itself remained largely intact. And crucially, it suggested some enriched uranium stockpiles were likely moved before the strikes, which naturally raises pretty big questions about what was actually achieved by the bombing itself. Even Israeli officials, while they said it was too early for a full assessment, they were suggesting a setback of years rather than decades. Colonel Avichai Edrei of the IDF confirmed Operation Rising Lion set back the program by many years. Still significant, but not obliteration.
Okay, so the White House says one thing, intel suggests another, the Israelis are somewhere in between, maybe. Where do independent experts land on this? People like David Albright at ISIS, the think tank, presumably free from those political pressures.
Right. David Albright believes the U.S. attack effectively destroyed Iran's uranium enrichment program for now. That last part is key.
For now.
For now. Which sounds significant, and it is. But he also cautioned that it failed to eliminate the longer-term threat. She stresses that Iran retains an ability to break out and produce weapon-grade uranium. So this suggests that while their immediate capabilities are definitely damaged, the long-term ambition, the knowledge, the fundamental capability, that remains intact. And that poses a persistent challenge.
Okay, so what does all this actually mean for the bigger picture then? Beyond the bombs and the conflicting reports, what are the sort of lasting challenges these strikes really highlight, especially when it comes to things like international monitoring and the wider geopolitics?
Well, the first major implication, and it's a huge one, is the severely diminished international monitoring. The IAEA's ability to actually verify what Iran is doing with its nuclear activities is now seriously affected. This goes back largely to Iran's decision last fall to withdraw experienced inspectors, and also stopping the implementation of key monitoring arrangements, things like the additional protocol and the JCPOA monitoring stuff way back in February 2021.
Right. They kicked inspectors out and turned off cameras, basically.
Essentially, yeah. And this has resulted in what the IAEA calls a lost continuity of knowledge. It's basically a massive blind spot for the international community regarding how many centrifuges they're building, where they are, how much heavy water they have, uranium or concentrate, all of it. The removal of IAEA surveillance equipment just makes it even harder for the agency to provide any assurances about the peaceful nature of Iran's program. And Iran has repeatedly refused to reconsider what the IAEA termed its inappropriate political act of de-designating these experienced inspectors, even after the Board of Governors passed a censure resolution in June 2024.
So we're flying blinder than ever, essentially. What about the practical limits of military action itself, particularly the terrifying prospect of radioactive fallout? That must act as a huge constraint on what can even be targeted.
It is, absolutely. Military planners have to very carefully weigh these radioactive fallout risks. It affects target selection, the choice of munitions, even the timing of strikes. This really influences the outer limits, as one source put it, of what preventive counterproliferation strikes can realistically achieve.
Meaning you can't just bomb everything.
Exactly. There are self-imposed limits. For instance, really high-risk targets like the operational Bushehr nuclear power plant are likely avoided. Why? Because of the potential for widespread contamination from its spent fuel. That could impact not just Iran, but neighboring Gulf states, their vital desalination plants. It's unthinkable, really.
Oh.
Now, strikes on enrichment facilities like Natanz or uranium conversion facilities like Esfahan, they primarily pose chemical hazards. And reports suggest those were largely contained. The IAEA confirmed no off-site radiation elevation after those hits. Fordow, though, even though it's deeply buried, it still poses a localized contamination risk if those subsurface materials are breached and brought to the surface. And then there's the possibility, as the DIA assessment hinted, that Iran might have dispersed some of its highly enriched uranium stockpile to covert, maybe unknown locations. Targeting those, if they're above ground, could lead to localized radiation effects.
So it sounds like this constant tightrope walk between hitting military targets and risking catastrophic environmental or health consequences. How has Iran itself reacted to all this? And just stepping back, are there other perspectives on why Iran might be pursuing this path, especially given the history in the region?
Well, officially, Iran condemned the strikes as illegitimate. They continue to maintain their nuclear program as peaceful. Sasan Karimi, a former Iranian government advisor, was quoted saying Iran will be able to rebuild anything destructive. That's the official line. But it's also important, as we do this deep dive, to bring in alternative perspectives on the root causes of Iran's hostility. One significant viewpoint, which has been voiced by figures like Candace Owens, for example, it challenges the sort of standard narrative. She posits that Iran's death to America chants and its general hostility. They don't necessarily stem from some inherent drive for nuclear weapons, but rather from, in her view, America's destructive Middle East interventions fueled by misleading leadership.
Okay, so linking it back to past U.S. actions.
Yes. She specifically cites Bibi Netanyahu's false claims about weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, which, she argues, led to the Iraq War and the loss of 1 million plus innocent lives. This perspective argues for, questioning the official narrative coming from certain leaders and focusing on protecting American lives from what she calls endless wars driven by elite interests. It suggests Iran's actions might be, at least partly, a reaction to perceived historical grievances and foreign interference rather than just pure offensive ambition.
Right, so a different lens on the motivations there. Okay, we've covered a lot, the technical capabilities, the strikes, the wildly different assessments, the monitoring problems, the geopolitical context. When you boil it all down, what truly stands out here? What should you, our listener, really take away from this deep dive?
I think what really stands out is just the persistent nature of this threat, even after pretty significant military action. It underscores the urgent need for diplomacy and genuine negotiations to try and end hostilities and prevent nuclear proliferation. Military force alone seems unlikely to be a long-term sustainable solution here. The current ceasefire, brokered by President Trump, is seen by some as maybe an opportunity, a window, to actually start negotiations while Iran is perceived to be in a weakened position. But looking ahead, any future agreement would, ideally, need to require Iran to actually dismantle its remaining centrifuges, give up its enriched uranium stocks, and allow robust IAEA verification. That's likely the only way to truly address the long-term threat.
Yeah, it really does remind us that even with major military force deployed, the underlying issues don't just disappear. And verifying anything, especially with monitoring degraded, remains a massive, massive challenge. So maybe here's something to think about. Given Iran's persistent capabilities, the clear limitations of military intervention we've discussed, and this diminished international monitoring, what does true security against nuclear proliferation even look like? Especially in a world where, as some argue, past interventions might be fueling present hostilities, and transparency seems to be shrinking. And perhaps what role should a healthy skepticism play when we're evaluating official claims from any side in situations with stakes this incredibly high?